Well, Corey, now we know who's going to be in the All-Star game. The coaches have selected their reserves. The lineups are set, except for, well, let's be honest, Anthony Davis isn't playing, and somebody will go into that spot. But the lineups are set, and we don't really talk about that as much. We go straight to the snubs. We go straight to who's not left out, man. Like, these were pretty good lineups, but that's not what anybody's talking about. And let's start in the East. Who did you see in the East that was snubbed that you thought really should have made the team?
I love that. We're like, these are the best players in the NBA, but we want to know who didn't get the credit that they deserve. But, let's give some flowers. I'm all for giving people credit where credit's due. I think, and we've talked about this before, the Indiana Pacers. Don't sleep on my Indiana Pacers. I love Sabonis. Sabonis, to me, I saw him play in Chicago last year, and I could not believe it. He was the most efficient player I've ever seen, like, in person in a very long time. And I was thinking, why is no one talking about this guy? This year, he has elevated his level of play. You think about this scenario for a second, Kurt. You trade your franchise player, right, midway through the season, and then who steps up and leads you to number 4 in the East? Sabonis is averaging a 20 and 10 double-double. It's amazing what he's been able to do every single night against everyone in the league. I love Sabonis.
And he was an all-star last year. He brings a certain credibility of, like, hey, I've done this before. I deserve to be here. It's not like he was a one-time, one-off kind of thing. To me, that brings up the other guy. To me, Bam Adebayo was the guy who I couldn't believe was left off this. A guy who's putting up, big numbers this year for Miami and playing well. He has not been the issue in Miami, and he plays phenomenal defense. But to me, and this is a conversation I started to have on Twitter, I also am going to say, hey, what he did in the bubble last year, what he did helping lead Miami counts. But on Twitter, I got a lot of people who say, no, it's just the first half of this season. I'd be curious your thoughts. Like, when you're considering who should be an all-star, what matters to you? What goes into that criteria?
In my mind, an all-star is someone who shows up for their team every single night and is able to basically be the guy, right? Who, when the bat signal's up in the air, who comes every single night and answers that call in this season, right? So I do think that this season it takes priority. However, I think you can give guys benefit of the doubt for people who have shown consistency over long periods of time in their career. So you mentioned Bam Adebayo and what he did in the finals. In the playoffs last year. I think that counts, right? And being able to say, look, we're giving this guy benefit of the doubt. I know he's maybe not averaging 28 points a season, but historically we've seen this, So that's kind of the way I look at it. But I don't think that should weigh in as much as this season.
No, this season should definitely be the primary factor for me too. Like, look, good players. Steph Curry's not playing. You don't put him in, right? Like, if guys are off, he's back this year, and you don't even question the popularity contest. He's going to win it. That's fine. But I think that I weigh those a little more. That consistency, to me, at the end of the day, we're going to look back at these guys' careers, and we're going to say, hey, Bam Adebayo made 8 all-star teams, and Sabonis made 5 all-star, whatever those numbers end up being. You want the best players from that era, not guys who had a one-off year. Like, I need to know that guy can do it consistently. I need to know. So I think, like, just the bottom line question of who's the best player, man, I'd take Bam over Nikola Vucevic personally, and I'd put him on the team over him. And that's despite the fact that, man, Vucevic deserves to be there. Like, I don't want to knock him much because those are some monster numbers he's putting up on a team that doesn't have much to go over. Like, everybody else you can name on the team is injured, right? It's been a rough year in Orlando. But am I going to put him in over Bam? This is the challenge, and I feel bad for the coaches. You're splitting hairs, right?
Yeah, and people take it personally, as we saw on Twitter.
Yes, we do. They do. And then what about in the West? Is there anybody in the West? I mean, look, let's be honest. The big name in the West is Devin Booker, right?
Yeah, I know. So this is a conversation that I think is, we talk about splitting hairs. Devin Booker, to me, is playing at a super high level. But to me personally, when I look at that Phoenix Suns team, it's funny, Kurt, I was looking at the stats. Devin Booker's numbers, I'm like all-star. But then when I watch the games, I'm thinking Chris Paul's the all-star.
Yeah.
Isn't that weird?
Chris Paul is, when you watch him in person, and if you know the game at all or watch a lot of basketball, he's the best floor general maybe ever, certainly of this generation. He has the ability to control a basketball game in a way that's hard to. I went back and watched a while ago, I believe it was the 2008 Olympics. So Kobe takes over in the second half. We come back, we beat Spain. It's really dramatic. You watch that second half again, Chris Paul does not put up the numbers. Kobe and other guys put up the numbers. Chris Paul completely controls the game. And like Pau Gasol talked about it afterward, he owned that second half and set everything up. He's amazing on that. And coaches, by the way, who vote for the reserves both recognize that and reward him for it.
Yeah, it's almost a difference between someone who's playing fantasy and and a coach who's like, who do I want on a team, right? Yeah. And I think Chris Paul, like, don't get me wrong, his numbers, he's averaging 16 and 8, right? So he has numbers to back up the All-Star bid, but I think for him, another element of an All-Star is not just you playing well, but can you elevate everyone else's game around you? And Chris Paul is a guy who does that. I mean, quite honestly, look at that team. Bridges, Aiden, Booker even has stood much to benefit by playing alongside Chris Paul. And I think when you have a guy like that, and then it translates to, hey, we're sitting at 4 in the Western Conference this year. We know who's in the West. I think that's really impressive, and I think Chris Paul is the reason why.
I think ultimately Devin Booker will probably get the Anthony Davis spot, right? Anthony Davis made it as a reserve, as he should. Another guy, by the way, not necessarily playing up to his standard numbers, but everybody's like, he's Anthony Davis. We're making him an all-star. Like, it's not a question. He will not play because of the strained calf. Somebody will go in that spot. My guess is Booker gets it. The other guy who can make a case, Mike Conley, is still the thing that has helped turn Utah around. He's perennially the I don't know the hard word to say something, but he is the guy who's always the best player not to make an all-star team. He's just always this close. It never quite cuts it, and I feel bad for him. But I think it's going to happen.
He's playing really well. But for me, if you're going to go to Utah, you got to go Jordan Clarkson. I mean, what he's been able to do off the bench, it's been unbelievable.
Yeah,
I think he gets the nod over Mike Conley. But I mean, I grew up in San Antonio where Mike Conley and those Memphis Grizzlies always gave San Antonio a really tough run. So I have the utmost respect for Mr. Conley. He can. I'm telling you, he's dangerous. But yeah, he's been playing extremely well. But for me, it would have to go Clarkson.
Clarkson is your clear front runner early, by the way, for sixth man of the year, which we're not going to get into today. But
another one is Christian Wood. I know he hasn't played in 2.5 weeks, but if he had played because of, without the injury, he for sure, in my mind, it was like, I know Rudy Gobert and Donovan Mitchell, they're doing something that we haven't seen in 20 years in Utah. And like the guys that they're replicating are, I don't know, 2 Hall of Famers named Stockton and Malone. I don't know if you heard of them. But yeah, so they're playing really well. But for me, Christian Wood has just elevated his game. But the only knock on him is that the Rockets are really bad.
Yeah. And by the way, one of the great pickups of the offseason, just Detroit kind of was like, no, we're not so sure about him. We don't want to pay him that much. You might have wanted to pay him that much.
Yeah. So up next, we have LeBron. We feel like we always talk about LeBron every week. It's a really great topic. He was recently in the news talking about, he kind of is combating this idea and narrative of rest. He's been playing a lot, leading the NBA in the past few games as Anthony Davis and Dennis Schroeder are both out. What are your thoughts on LeBron talking about he doesn't need to rest more and this narrative around resting stars in the NBA?
Well, I think the narrative for him is just that. It's part of his MVP pitches. Man, I play every night. I am there. Like, I am there for my teammates when they need me. That's part of the pitch for him when he's going up against Joel Embiid, who has missed, I'm not sure of the actual number, but a handful of games, right? And will probably miss more. You have to be careful with Joel Embiid's knees, back, and you're going to have to rest him. That said, going into the playoffs, when LeBron has been, he's defies father time somehow in a way that's just not really human. But I still think in the second half, once they get Davis and Schroeder back and they get comfortably ensconced in the top handful, because I don't know that seeding is their biggest concern, you got to get him some nights off. This is a condensed schedule. You've got, or at least back off his minutes. He's playing, they've had 4 overtime games recently. He's been pushing or over 40 minutes in all those games. You got to find a way to get him some nights off just to have the legs. Not worried about injuries. You need him fresh. You need 100% LeBron James and Anthony Davis on this team, because with all due respect to Dennis Schroeder, who's probably their 3rd best player, that drop off from 1 and 2 to the rest of that roster is pretty steep. You've got to have LeBron and Davis. So in the second half, Vogel's got to find a way to talk to LeBron and get his minutes down a little.
I mean, when 1 and 2 are LeBron, who's arguably one of the greatest players to ever play the game, and then 2, Anthony Davis, who's just unbelievable. Yeah, I mean, that's a hard 1 and 2 to compete against as far as the drop off of talent there. But yeah, I think at the end of the day, players want to play. That's why they play this game, right? So, and LeBron wants to win. So I think that he's willing to do whatever it takes to help his team win. And right now, without Anthony Davis and Dennis Schroeder, someone has to help this team be competitive. And that load goes on LeBron James, and that's just part of being the guy. So I understand the concern, but it's also not forever. And this is only a 5-game stretch. And I understand, 4 overtime games, by the way, that's a crazy stat. I mean, how many, what's the record for overtime games in a short amount of state? That's wild to me. So I think we're kind of blowing this small portion out of the water here, in my personal opinion. But I understand we need something to talk about on a week-to-week basis. But when Anthony Davis and Schroeder comes back, I think we'll see back to a 32-minute per game kind of LeBron James.
Exactly. We are mountaining the molehill here a little bit, but that said, I just, for them, seeding matters less. I think if you're Utah, getting the number 1 seed has a real advantage for you in a way that the Lakers can win on the road, and maybe even the Clippers, who are a pretty veteran team. I don't know that it matters as much to them. So for the Lakers, as long as they're healthy, what matters is they're healthy and stable going into the postseason, right? If they're those 2 things, are we picking anybody else to come out of the West?
I don't know. I don't know. I saw this really great stat though on the games last night, and it said, for the teams that were in the Eastern and Western Conference Finals, they're all sitting around 500 right now, right? Except for the Lakers, and the Lakers have somehow, with the shortest offseason, right, they have somehow been able to be at the top of the West or near the top for the entire season. And I think this is exactly what we're talking about as far as professionalism, discipline, attention to detail. But yeah, if I'm betting on any team to be able to kind of focus on, hey, how do we succeed and manage minutes and manage our health? It's definitely going to be the Lakers. There's no other team that I think comes close. And I think when it comes to home court advantage and the seeding, if you can play more games at home, basketball players, professional athletes, they're all creatures of habit. So if you can kind of just make sure everyone's routine is very similar, then it helps you be able to get into those rhythms and play at a high level, because, your pregame meal is the same, the routine's the same. You know how long it takes to get to the arena. All those little things matter, especially in a time like playoffs, when you really have to go back and rely on muscle memory and routine to be successful.
And routine has been blown up this season because of the COVID testing, because of 3 times a day on game day, the condensed schedule, the travel is a little more intense. It's been harder on players. They don't really like to talk about that because it's not a good public complaint, but it's been a much tougher season for them in terms of just being in a rhythm.
And then last but not least, Demarcus Cousins was waived by the Houston Rockets. The big man was not happy with his minutes or role in Houston. Now he's looking at the market. Where do you think he lands, Kurt?
I don't think there's that big a market for him. I don't know how much you got to watch of him in Houston. Once Christian Wood went down and they had to put him in a meaningful role as a center, it's not on him, because I love DeMarcus, but the man's coming off an ACL injury and an Achilles injury, and he's moving like a guy who comes off an ACL injury and Achilles injury. Unfortunately, his lateral movement's just not there. He was getting crushed defensively. Teams were just exposing him. It wasn't working for either side. I think that limits his market, but the team that, he's been linked to Miami before. I know that there have been rumors about the Lakers. I can tell you that that's not happening probably. Toronto's the one team I think might have real interest, because remember, they clearly miss Marc Gasol and Serge Ibaka up there in the middle. He's a guy who can come in and fill a role for them and help them and give them solid minutes in the paint. And that's a smart scheme team around Nick Nurse who can find ways to use him.
Yeah, this is one of those scenarios for me that you have a guy who all-star caliber player coming off injury for the past few years, trying to figure out, am I still an all-star? And, or do I have to, accept a smaller role on a different team? And that, I think, is a hard kind of process for anybody. And I love the idea of, look, bet on yourself, go to the open market and say, why would I sign the veteran minimum? I'm over here trying to be another all-star, and I believe I can do that. But at the same time, too, you're right. I think when you look at the market, defense is kind of the scheme for big guys in the NBA right now. You look at, JaVale McGee or Dwight Howard, who has been successful for teams in that role as either coming off the bench and being a huge defensive presence, or someone who can plug the middle or be able to even guard on the perimeter. These kind of smaller guys, a Vucevic type or an Anthony Davis type, that has been kind of the key. Can you get me 10 and 10? So I think with Cousins, if he's not able to provide that on the defensive side, he's going to have to accept a smaller role. And for me, one team that jumps out is Golden State. I think that they're struggling with the center position. I think Wiseman, although he's the future, he's a little young and he could use some help. I know Kevon Looney has given them, some valuable minutes, but look, Boogie could give you that offensive firepower. And let's be honest, like the Golden State Warriors don't have a great defensive prowess anyway. So I feel like hey, let's just keep adding firepower.
If they want to lock you down defensively, they're going to go with Draymond at the 5 anyway, right? Like that's their defensive lineup anyway. So yeah, that's actually something that could work. I think you have to find at this point, he's going to have to accept the role and play it. He's just not back to being the guy who can kind of dominate a game. And you're right, by the way, unless you're providing Jokic Embiid level offense as a center, your primary responsibility is defensively. It's great if you can get points, but if you're not getting stops, it's a bit of a problem for the team. So I'm curious where he lands and how you use him in a system. And can you put him in a drop back system where he's just so big and so long and has seen so much, he can still be effective? I think it's there. I think it's got to be the right fit.
Yeah, so we'll see where he ends up, but time is ticking.